When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I mean, I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. I mean, this clearly restricted the amount of playtime I had outdoors, and to make it worse, I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at my house, and they didn't allow me to go to anyone else's either. I had to finish homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books, and then they made me write book reports on them to prove that I actually read them. Now, even though those above rules were quite frustrating to me as a child, they weren't what upset me the most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on the behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty about accidents or mistakes I made, and my father only knew one emotion: frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beating me for misbehaving. But enough about them, let's talk about my school's psychologist. For his own privacy, we'll call him Dr. Tanner. Like most junior high schools, a psychologist is always available on campus during school hours to assist any student in need of counseling, whether it's emotional, academic, social, behavioral, etc. To be honest, I have never seen any students talking with Dr. Tanner. Every day I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through the door's little window. He would always be in there, alone, working on some paperwork. I guess that most of the kids were simply too afraid to speak about their problems with an adult who was practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go into his office. March 2nd, 1993. That was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office and knocked. Through his window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion me to come in, which I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I had rambled to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver and I finally stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel, arms folded and head nodding. I half expected him to begin talking about how everything I just said was untrue, that my parents would love me dearly, and blah blah blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner just leaned towards me with this big grin on his face and said, "You know, I am the best school psychologist in the world, and I promise you, I can fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" "I have my ways," he replied. "I have my ways. I am a man of my word, and I promise you that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better. Forever." And after a brief pause, he continued, "Although, I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow, and you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret." And I promised. The following day, after school, I returned to Dr. Tanner's office. It was around 4 p.m. when I entered, and after a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds of the door's tiny window. "There, now we have all the privacy we need." He began to talk about my likes and interests, my favorite subjects in school, my least favorite teachers, and things of the like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly took his offer, considering my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini-fridge and fidgeted around before settling down 2 open cans of soda on the desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drug Dr. Tanner placed in my drink. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when I did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed, and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming and tugging at the cuffs, but I soon gave up. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned along the walls, photographs of famous athletes on shelves, and in the middle of the room was an old television and Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked along it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in a room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy if I hadn't been handcuffed to this bed frame. And then my stomach sank as the door creaked open and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Now listen, remember that I'm here to help you, and I would never hurt you, okay? Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth and the cuffs from my hand. My first instinct was to begin to cry, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel very safe. He smiled at me. You're gonna be staying here for a while, and during this time, you're allowed to play with any of the toys in this room while I'm at home. But when I leave the house, I'll need to cuff one of your hands to the back of the bed. But you can still watch the television, but I want you to only watch the news channels when I'm away. I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he had given me. So, Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knee. You go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner. He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. And all that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. At about 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room, carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying in the room. Well, about a month, give or take a few weeks. I just have some work I need to do. The following morning, I awoke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. Hey, buddy, you don't have to wake up right now if you don't want to, but I'm gonna need to put these back on. He clamped the cold steel handcuffs onto my wrist. I gazed up at him. He was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped over his shoulders, and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him sitting around school, but before leaving, he placed the TV's remote next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. The first thing I saw upon turning it on was a breaking news segment. An important-looking police officer stood at a podium surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through a speech. A statewide Amber Alert has been issued as of this morning. We have several investigators working towards identifying potential abductors, but as of right now, there is not much evidence. Faculty members state that the boy had been last seen around 4 or 5 in the evening on... I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. My last year's yearbook picture. Captions for the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, my town. Above the picture were alternating titles. FBI begins search for a child, and kidnapping suspect unknown, and potential runaway. The live footage continued, and 2 figures I soon recognized as my mom and my dad stepped up to the podium. Both had red eyes, and tears were streaming down my mother's face. And then she took hold of the microphone. I've never seen so much emotion come from my mother before. As she wept on live TV, stuttering on sentences such as, "Please return my baby back to me, and I'm so sorry, and please come back home." My father then took the microphone. I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring back his son safely, and lastly, begged for my forgiveness. I know I haven't been the best father, but God damn it, I do wish I had been now. Please, bring my boy back. Shortly after, I turned the power off. My emotions were mixed, for I had never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much. But at the same time, I felt relief. I now know how much my mom and dad love me. 4 weeks had passed, but Dr. Tanner had been treating me with the utmost respect. He leaves me in the morning, cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me. We talk and play games. I never would have guessed how good Dr. Tanner was at Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning, Dr. Tanner woke me up before heading off to work, and I noticed a stern look on his face, and I realized it was 3 hours earlier than he would usually wake me. Hey buddy, I need you to watch the news today. No exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it. I of course complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title, Human Remains Found. 2 staunch-looking men in suits stood aside one another and began speaking. We are displeased to bring up such an unfortunate news this morning regarding our missing child case from earlier this month. One of the men bowed his head while the one speaking shuffled through some papers and then continued. Remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath a highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, although not much of it is left. The body has been decapitated and much has been burnt to ash and bone. The screen shifted to a helicopter view of the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of a tall overpass, and the man's voice could still be heard. Within the bag, police found a junior high school identification card labeled as such. The screen showed the school ID card I had always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the 2 men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents, who were sitting among reporters. My mom's face held a painful grimace, and my father sulked, his head down at his knees. I shut the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water into my hand. He then placed his hands onto my shoulders and smiled. I made you a promise, didn't I? I nodded, tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. And you need to make me another promise. He told me that I need to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep, and that from here on, I am never to tell anyone that I ever met with him. And I promised. I told you, I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I? And he was right. I awoke later that night to find myself lying in the middle of a park, stars shining brightly across the night sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far from my school. A mile or so down the road, I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the steps leading to the front door. I hesitated, but then I called out to him, and he lifted his head slowly. But when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet and he ran towards me, arms open, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was so right. Things had changed with my family. My parents smiled more often and treated me lovingly. I could not ask for a more happy ending. Every now and then I could see Dr. Tanner on campus, walking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another, but sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and smile. But I always keep my promise, and I always pretend I've never met him. But there will always be one question, forever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass?